You were not supposed to see this by accident, and deep down, part of you already knows that. Something has been trying to reach you for a long time now. Not once, not twice, but over and over again in ways you almost dismissed because they seemed too small, too strange, or too easy to explain away. But lately the silence around you has started to feel different, hasn't it? Not peaceful, not normal, heavy. Like something unseen has been standing quietly at the edge of your life waiting for you to finally notice it. Maybe it started during one of those late nights when the house was completely still and you suddenly woke up for no reason at exactly the same time again. Maybe it was while sitting alone in your car after work staring through the windshield long after the engine stopped running because you could not explain why your chest felt so tight. You tried to ignore it. You told yourself you were just tired, burned out, overthinking everything again. But the feeling kept returning. The same numbers, the same thoughts, the same pull in your spirit every time you tried to move on and pretend nothing inside you was changing. And what unsettled you the most was not the signs themselves. It was how personal they started to feel, as if something understood the parts of you nobody else sees. The disappointment you never talk about, the exhaustion hidden behind your smile, the quiet fear that maybe you waited too long for things to finally change. You have carried that feeling for months now, haven't you? Watching other people move forward while your own life felt paused somewhere between hope and frustration. Smiling in conversations while privately wondering if anyone truly notices how tired you have become. There were moments recently when you almost gave up asking for clarity altogether because every door seemed to close right when you thought something good was finally about to happen. One opportunity disappeared without warning. One conversation ended strangely. One relationship slowly drifted into silence. And after enough disappointments, part of you stopped expecting anything meaningful to happen at all. But what if the silence was never empty? What if those delays were not punishment? Because there is something you need to realize now before you dismiss this feeling one more time. Sometimes the reason nothing made sense is because you were only seeing the loss and not the protection hidden inside it. You thought you were being ignored when in reality something was keeping you from walking into situations that would have broken you in ways you could not yet understand. And the unsettling part is this. Deep down, you already felt that possibility before tonight. That is why you could never fully shake the feeling that something bigger was happening beneath the surface of your ordinary life. That strange pull you feel right now is not random. The repeated interruptions, the emotional heaviness, the moments of sudden stillness that appear out of nowhere. They are connected. And after the seventh time, after all the signs you almost laughed off and all the moments you nearly ignored, something inside you has started waking up to the possibility that this story is not unfolding the way you thought it was. The strange part was not that the signs kept appearing. The strange part was how quickly you learned to ignore them. Human beings can adapt to almost anything, even emptiness, even disappointment. After enough delayed answers and quiet nights, you stopped reacting the way you used to. You began moving through your days on autopilot, waking up to the same alarm, driving the same roads, standing in the same grocery store aisles pretending your mind was not somewhere else entirely. From the outside, your life looked normal enough. You answered messages. You showed up to work. You laughed when people expected you to laugh. But internally something felt disconnected, like part of you had been waiting for a phone call that never came. And still, every once in a while, the feeling would return without warning. Usually late at night. Usually when the world around you finally became quiet enough for your real thoughts to surface. There was one night in particular you cannot stop thinking about now. You had just gotten home after another exhausting day that somehow left you emotionally drained, even though nothing dramatic had happened. You tossed your keys onto the kitchen counter, heated leftovers you barely touched, and sat on the edge of your couch staring at the television without paying attention to anything on the screen. The room was dim except for the soft light coming from the hallway, and for some reason you suddenly felt that familiar heaviness again. Not fear exactly, more like awareness, as if something important was hovering just outside your understanding. You remember reaching for your phone to distract yourself, scrolling mindlessly, trying to drown out the feeling the way you always did. But then your thumb stopped. A random video clip appeared with a sentence that mirrored a thought you had never spoken out loud to anyone. Not online, not in person, not even to yourself completely. And the moment you saw it, a chill moved through you because it felt too specific to be coincidence. You quickly brushed it off and locked your phone, but deep down the moment stayed with you. That is what has been unsettling you lately. The growing realization that these moments are becoming harder to explain away. You are beginning to notice patterns in places where you used to see randomness. Certain conversations arriving at exact moments. Old memories resurfacing for no clear reason. Songs playing at strange times with lyrics that seem to answer questions you have been carrying silently for months. And while part of you wants to dismiss all of it, another part cannot ignore how deeply personal it feels. Especially after everything that has happened recently. Because if you are honest, the last season of your life has changed you more than anyone realizes. There were nights you sat in complete silence wondering why everything meaningful seemed delayed for you while other people moved ahead so easily. You watched doors close one after another until eventually you stopped knocking altogether. You became careful with your hope, careful with your expectations, careful not to believe too much in anything that could disappoint you again. But something is beginning to crack through that numbness now, and it scares you because you do not know whether to trust it yet. The hardest thing about carrying disappointment for so long is that eventually you stop recognizing yourself without it. And maybe that is why the signs kept returning. Not to frighten you, not to pressure you, but because some part of your spirit was slowly falling asleep beneath the weight of waiting, and something unseen refused to let it disappear completely. You started noticing how tired you had become in the quiet moments nobody else ever saw. Not physical exhaustion exactly, although that was there too. It was deeper than that. A kind of emotional weariness that settled into your routine so gradually you barely recognized when it began. Even simple things felt heavier now. Getting out of bed in the morning, replying to texts, pretending to care about conversations that sounded distant and hollow inside your mind. There was a time when you used to believe things would eventually turn around for you. You used to carry excitement about the future, imagining how different life could feel if even one meaningful thing finally worked out. But disappointment has a way of changing people slowly, not all at once, quietly, until one day you realize you no longer expect good news anymore, because expecting things only made the silence hurt worse. That is where you found yourself recently, existing more than living, waiting without knowing what you were waiting for. And maybe the hardest part was how invisible it all felt. Nobody around you seemed to notice the internal battle constantly running beneath your calm expression. They saw you functioning. They saw you surviving. But they did not see the moments when you sat alone in your apartment with every light off except the one above the stove, staring into nothing while your thoughts spiraled in circles you could not escape. They did not hear the questions you asked yourself during those sleepless nights when your mind refused to settle down. Questions like why certain doors kept closing no matter how hard you tried, why opportunities disappeared at the last second, why people who once promised they would stay suddenly drifted away without explanation. You replayed everything repeatedly, searching for the moment you got it wrong. The moment you somehow ruined your own future without realizing it. And over time, regret started becoming louder than hope. There was one rainy Thursday evening that still lingers in your memory. Traffic had been backed up for miles, and by the time you finally pulled into your parking lot, your nerves already felt stretched thin. You stayed sitting in your car long after the windshield wipers stopped moving, listening to the faint tapping of rain against the roof while the dashboard clock glowed softly in the dark. For a few minutes you just sat there breathing, too emotionally drained to even walk inside. Then out of nowhere you remembered something someone told you months earlier. A sentence you dismissed at the time because it sounded impossible. They said sometimes unanswered prayers are not absence, but protection in disguise. At the time those words irritated you because they felt too convenient, too easy, almost like something people say when they do not have real answers. But sitting there in the silence that night, something about those words returned differently. Not louder, just heavier, more real somehow. And for the first time in a long while, you allowed yourself to consider the possibility that maybe not everything lost was meant to be kept. Maybe some closed doors had protected you from versions of your life that would have left you emptier than before. But even then, part of you resisted believing it fully because trust does not come easily after long seasons of disappointment. Still, the feeling stayed with you. Quietly, persistently, like something unseen was trying to shift the way you viewed your entire story before it was too late to understand what the waiting had actually been doing inside you. After that night in the parking lot, something subtle began changing inside you, although you could not fully explain it yet. The external parts of your life still looked mostly the same. The same routines. The same unanswered questions. The same quiet apartment waiting for you at the end of every long day. But internally, your attention started shifting toward things you used to overlook completely. You began noticing how often certain moments appeared right before your thoughts spiraled into hopelessness. A song playing at the exact second you were about to break down emotionally. A stranger saying something oddly specific that echoed a private fear you had never spoken aloud. An unexpected memory resurfacing out of nowhere while you stood in line at a coffee shop or folded laundry late at night. None of it was dramatic enough to force belief. That was what made it unsettling. Everything arrived gently, almost carefully, as if whatever was trying to reach you understood that pushing too hard would only make you pull away again. And the truth is, you had become very skilled at pulling away, especially from anything that required vulnerability, because somewhere along the way you stopped trusting your own expectations. Every disappointment had trained you to lower them further. Every delayed answer taught you not to hope too quickly. You started preparing yourself emotionally for loss before things even had the chance to fall apart. It felt safer that way. Safer to expect nothing than to carry the crushing weight of another letdown. But the strange thing about protecting your heart for too long is that eventually you begin blocking out the very things trying to heal it too. That realization hit you unexpectedly one Saturday afternoon while cleaning out an old kitchen drawer filled with random receipts, expired coupons, and tangled charging cords you forgot you even owned. Buried beneath the clutter was a folded note written in your own handwriting from almost 2 years earlier. You stared at it for several seconds before opening it because you already sensed what it was. A list of personal goals. Things you once prayed for with complete sincerity. Peace, stability, direction, a meaningful connection, confidence that your life actually mattered. Reading those words felt almost surreal because you barely recognized the version of yourself who wrote them. That person still believed things could improve. That person still expected life to eventually make sense. You sat down at the edge of your couch holding the paper while late afternoon sunlight spilled quietly through the blinds across the floor, and for the first time in months you felt emotion rise inside you that was not frustration or exhaustion. It was grief. Grief for how much disappointment had hardened parts of you that used to feel alive. And in that moment another thought surfaced that you could not shake afterward. What if the repeated signs were not trying to scare you? What if they were trying to wake you up before you completely lost touch with the hopeful version of yourself that still existed underneath all the disappointment? Because the truth is, you had not stopped longing for meaning. You had only stopped believing it would find you. Yet somehow, despite every attempt to numb yourself emotionally, the interruptions kept happening. Quietly, consistently, like gentle reminders arriving through ordinary moments, refusing to let your spirit disappear into resignation completely. And the more you paid attention, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that something had been guiding your attention all along, not through force or fear, but through patterns so personal they bypassed logic entirely and reached the part of you still searching for light inside the silence. The more aware you became of those quiet patterns, the more uncomfortable your inner conflict started to feel. Part of you wanted to lean into the possibility that your life was not as abandoned as it once seemed. But another part had become deeply afraid of believing too much again. You had spent too much time recovering from disappointment to easily trust hope now. That was the real battle nobody else could see. Not whether signs existed. Not whether something meaningful was happening beneath the surface. The real battle was whether your heart could survive trusting again if all of this turned out to mean nothing. And honestly, there were days when cynicism felt safer than faith ever did. At least cynicism protected you from getting hurt. Hope required vulnerability. Hope meant risking disappointment one more time. You remember one evening when that tension inside you became almost impossible to ignore. You were sitting at your kitchen table with an untouched cup of coffee growing cold beside you while rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. Your laptop screen glowed in front of you with another rejection email open across the screen. Another opportunity gone. Another plan collapsing quietly before it even had the chance to become real. Normally, you would have shrugged it off by now, pretended it did not affect you. But that night felt different. Something inside you finally cracked under the weight of constantly trying to stay emotionally composed. You leaned back in your chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time, wondering how many times a person could keep rebuilding themselves before exhaustion finally won. The silence in the apartment felt enormous. Not peaceful, just painfully empty. And then, without even realizing why, your eyes drifted toward the old folded note still sitting near the corner of the counter where you left it days earlier. The list of things you once believed were still possible for your life. For several seconds you just stared at it while a strange thought quietly surfaced inside you. What if every delay had changed you so much that you no longer recognized the person those future blessings were originally meant for? That thought unsettled you deeply because it forced you to confront something painful. Somewhere during all the waiting, you had slowly started disconnecting from yourself. You stopped doing little things that once made you feel alive. You stopped reaching out to people, stopped dreaming openly, stopped believing your future could carry anything other than more waiting. Even your prayers had changed. They became shorter, more cautious, less expectant. Sometimes you would begin speaking honestly from your heart, and then suddenly stop halfway through because disappointment had taught you to guard your emotions before they fully surfaced. But as heavy as that realization felt, something else emerged with it that you could not explain. Beneath all the numbness, beneath the fear and exhaustion and confusion, there was still a small part of you refusing to fully let go. A quiet part still listening, still searching, still noticing every strange interruption and every moment that felt too personal to dismiss completely. And perhaps that is why the signs kept finding you during ordinary moments instead of dramatic ones, through silence instead of spectacle, through timing instead of force. Because whatever was trying to reach you understood that your spirit had become fragile from waiting too long. It was not trying to overwhelm you. It was trying to gently pull you back toward yourself before hopelessness became your permanent identity. And slowly, almost reluctantly, you began realizing something that would have sounded impossible to you months earlier. Maybe the reason certain doors stayed closed was not because you were forgotten. Maybe some endings had quietly protected you from futures that looked promising on the surface, but would have slowly emptied you from the inside. You began revisiting memories you had tried very hard to move past. Not because you wanted to stay trapped in the past, but because suddenly those moments no longer looked the same. Things you once labeled as failures started carrying a different emotional weight when viewed through the possibility that not every closed door had been punishment. And honestly, that realization disturbed you more than comforted you at first. Because if some of those painful endings had actually protected you, then it meant your understanding of the last few years might have been incomplete the entire time. There was one memory in particular that kept resurfacing no matter how many times you tried to push it away. A relationship you once believed would change everything. You remember how certain you felt back then. How convinced you were that this person was finally the answer to all the loneliness and uncertainty you carried for so long. You built emotional futures in your head around conversations, plans, little promises whispered during late-night phone calls and long drives through empty streets lit by gas stations and traffic lights glowing against the dark. And when it ended, it did not just hurt emotionally. It shattered something deeper inside you. For months afterward, you questioned your own judgment, your worth, your ability to recognize what was real anymore. You replayed every conversation trying to figure out where things changed. But no matter how much analyzing you did, closure never fully came. Eventually, you stopped searching for explanations because the disappointment exhausted you too deeply. Yet recently, that memory returned differently. Not with bitterness this time, but with clarity. You started recognizing things you ignored before. The constant anxiety you carried during that season. How often you abandoned your own peace, trying to hold everything together. How disconnected from yourself you slowly became, while desperately trying to keep something alive that was quietly draining you. And for the first time, you saw the ending differently. Not as proof that you were unwanted, but as a rescue you misunderstood because it arrived disguised as loss. That shift in perspective shook you because suddenly other disappointments started rearranging themselves too. The job opportunity that disappeared unexpectedly right before you planned to relocate. The friendship that faded after you changed in ways certain people no longer understood. The plans that collapsed even when you worked yourself emotionally thin trying to force them into existence. At the time, each loss felt personal, almost cruel. But now you could not stop noticing how many of those closed paths eventually revealed hidden problems you never saw while standing inside them. And still, despite all these realizations, your internal conflict remained. Part of you wanted to believe there was meaning woven through the delays and disappointments. But another part feared becoming too hopeful again. Because what if you were simply searching for patterns to survive emotionally? What if none of this actually meant anything? That question followed you everywhere lately. During your morning commute, while reheating leftovers after work, during those silent moments before sleep when your thoughts became impossible to distract yourself from anymore. But even with all the doubt, one truth continued growing impossible to ignore. The silence around your life no longer felt completely empty. There was movement inside it now. Subtle, unseen, difficult to explain logically, yet deeply personal all the same. Almost like something had been slowly repositioning your attention away from what you lost and toward what you survived without realizing it at the time. And somewhere beneath all the exhaustion and guardedness, you started sensing that maybe the hardest seasons of your life were never designed to destroy your future. Maybe they were separating you from paths that would have quietly destroyed your peace instead. The shift became impossible to ignore after that seventh moment. Not because something dramatic happened overnight, but because for the first time the pattern reached a part of you that logic could not fully silence anymore. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening that looked completely forgettable from the outside. You had stopped at a small grocery store on your way home after another mentally exhausting day. The kind where every conversation at work felt heavier than it should have, and every hour somehow moved both too slowly and too fast at the same time. Your mind was crowded with practical worries while you pushed the shopping cart through half-empty aisles under fluorescent lights that made everything feel colder than it really was. You were not thinking about signs or meaning or any of the strange experiences that had been following you lately. In fact, part of you was actively trying not to think about them anymore because the emotional tension had started becoming too overwhelming. You just wanted one normal evening where your thoughts would finally quiet down. But then something small happened that stopped you in place. An old song began playing softly through the store speakers. Not a popular song, not something you had heard in years. Just an old melody tied to a memory so personal it immediately pulled you backward emotionally before you could stop it. Suddenly, you were no longer standing beside shelves filled with canned soup and paper towels. You were remembering a different version of yourself entirely. A version that still believed life was leading somewhere meaningful. A version of you before the disappointments piled up, before the exhaustion, before you learned how to emotionally prepare for silence instead of expecting joy. And standing there in the middle of that quiet grocery store aisle, something inside you broke open unexpectedly. Not loudly, no dramatic scene, just a sudden wave of emotion rising into your chest so strongly you had to stop moving for a moment and steady your breathing. Because in that instant you realized how long it had been since you truly felt connected to yourself. You had spent so much time surviving emotionally that you forgot what hope even sounded like inside your own mind anymore. The strangest part was not the song itself. It was the timing. Earlier that same day, you had almost deleted the old note from your kitchen counter after convincing yourself it no longer mattered. You had nearly thrown away the final reminder of the person you once hoped to become. And now here you were hours later feeling something pull at your spirit again in a way that felt impossible to dismiss completely. As you drove home afterward, the city lights blurred softly through your windshield while the same thought repeated quietly in your mind over and over. What if these moments were never interruptions? What if they were invitations? Invitations to stop seeing yourself only through the lens of what failed. Invitations to recognize that maybe the silence surrounding your life had been carrying something deeper than abandonment all along. That thought unsettled you because it challenged the identity you built around disappointment. If the waiting had meaning, then perhaps your story was not ending in the emptiness you feared. Perhaps the delays had been shaping something inside you quietly this entire time. And although you still did not fully understand what was coming, one thing became clear that night as you sat alone in your apartment listening to the distant sound of traffic outside your window. The seventh moment felt different because for the first time, instead of immediately dismissing what you felt, you allowed yourself to stay present with it. And somewhere deep beneath the confusion and exhaustion, something inside you finally whispered back. For the next few days, you moved through life differently without fully understanding why. Nothing around you had changed yet, but internally it felt like something long asleep had started opening its eyes again. The heaviness was still there sometimes. The uncertainty had not magically disappeared. Bills still needed to be paid. Your apartment still felt too quiet at night. Certain wounds still ached when memories surfaced unexpectedly. But underneath all of it, there was now a strange awareness following you into ordinary moments. Almost like you were beginning to sense movement inside the silence instead of only emptiness. And then came the realization that changed everything. It happened late one evening while you were cleaning old files from your laptop, trying to distract yourself from another restless night. You came across archived emails connected to a job opportunity you once desperately wanted. At the time, losing that opportunity devastated you more than anyone realized. You had already imagined the apartment you would rent in the new city, the routines you would build there, the fresh start you believed would finally fix the loneliness and emotional exhaustion you carried for years. When the opportunity disappeared without explanation, it felt cruel, pointless, like life had pulled hope away from you again right when you needed it most. But as you scrolled through old messages that night, something unexpected caught your attention. An article attached in one of the archived company newsletters mentioned massive layoffs and internal instability that began only months after your application was rejected. The deeper you looked, the more unsettling the timeline became. Friends of former employees describing burnout, financial problems, sudden closures, people trapped in situations that emotionally drained them far worse than the life you thought you were trying to escape. You sat back slowly in your chair staring at the screen while a chill moved through you, because for the first time you saw that rejection from an entirely different angle. If you had gotten exactly what you begged for back then, your life might have collapsed in ways you never anticipated. The thing you mourned as loss may have quietly protected your peace before you even understood what danger looked like. That realization spread through you slowly, almost painfully, because it forced you to reconsider so many other disappointments too. Suddenly the silence no longer looked empty. The delays no longer felt random. It was as if invisible hands had been redirecting your path away from futures that appeared beautiful on the surface but carried hidden weight underneath. And perhaps the most emotional part of all was realizing how angry you had become at yourself during those seasons. You blamed yourself for not being enough, not praying correctly, not trying hard enough. You spent years believing certain doors closed because something about you was flawed or forgotten. But what if many of those endings had nothing to do with your worth? What if protection often arrives looking exactly like disappointment in the beginning? That thought broke something open inside you because suddenly your entire story started rearranging itself emotionally. The unanswered prayers, the delayed relationships, the plans that fell apart at the last second. Maybe none of those moments were evidence of abandonment. Maybe they were signs that something deeper had been unfolding quietly behind scenes you could not yet see. You walked to the kitchen afterward and stood silently beside the sink, staring out the dark window above it while distant headlights moved through the streets below. For once, the silence around you did not feel cold. It felt patient, alive somehow. And although you still did not know exactly what was coming next, one truth settled deeply into your spirit that night. The things you once begged to keep may have been the very things you needed protection from all along. After that night, you stopped obsessing over what was missing and started paying attention to what remained. That shift sounds small when spoken out loud, but internally it changed the atmosphere of your entire life. For so long your mind had been trained to focus only on absence. The unanswered messages, the opportunities that disappeared, the people who slowly faded away, the dreams that never arrived when you expected them to. But now something quieter was pulling at your awareness. You began noticing how many times you had survived. Seasons that should have emotionally broken you completely. You noticed how many moments of unexpected strength appeared right when you thought you had nothing left inside yourself to give. And perhaps most unsettling of all, you started realizing that the strange feeling following you lately was not fear anymore. It was anticipation. Not loud anticipation. Not excitement in the normal sense. More like the atmosphere before sunrise when the sky has not changed yet, but somehow you already know darkness is losing its hold. The feeling followed you everywhere now. During slow morning drives to work while pale sunlight spilled across empty intersections. While standing in line waiting for coffee with tired strangers staring silently at their phones. during quiet evenings folding laundry while distant traffic hummed outside your apartment windows. Ordinary moments suddenly carried unusual emotional weight, as if life itself was gently trying to get your attention through stillness instead of chaos. One afternoon you caught yourself doing something you had not done in months. You were making plans again, small ones at first, rearranging your living room, looking into weekend trips a few hours outside the city, thinking about goals without immediately assuming disappointment would follow. The realization startled you because you had spent so long emotionally preparing for loss that hope almost felt unfamiliar now. And yet beneath that cautious hope remained a lingering question you still could not answer completely. Why had all these signs intensified recently? Why now? Why after so much silence? That question stayed with you one evening as you sat on your apartment floor sorting through old boxes you never fully unpacked after your last move. Inside one box was a framed photo you had not seen in years. The picture captured a version of you smiling freely in a way that almost felt foreign now. You stared at it for several seconds before realizing something important. The person in that photograph believed life was happening for them, not against them. Somewhere along the way, disappointment convinced you otherwise. But now, for reasons you still struggled to explain, logically, that belief was slowly returning. Not because your external circumstances suddenly became perfect. They had not. Certain problems still remained unresolved. Some nights were still lonely. Some questions still had no answers. But internally, you sensed movement beginning where numbness once lived. It felt as though something had been preparing you emotionally before allowing certain things to enter your life. And perhaps that preparation required isolation, delays, and silence because the version of you from before would not have understood what truly mattered once those changes arrived. That thought stayed with you long after midnight, while soft city lights flickered through the blinds and the apartment settled into silence around you. For the first time in years, the unknown future no longer felt entirely threatening. Mysterious, yes. Uncertain, absolutely. But not empty. There was something approaching now. You could feel it in the quiet shifts happening inside your spirit before anything visible changed around you. And deep down, beneath all the doubt and caution still lingering inside your heart, you were beginning to understand something life had been trying to teach you through every delay. Sometimes what arrives first is not the blessing itself. Sometimes what arrives first is the ability to finally receive it without losing yourself in the process. What changed next was not your circumstances. It was your relationship with the waiting itself. Before, every delay felt like evidence that life was passing you by while everyone else moved forward. You measured time through disappointments. Another month without answers. Another year feeling emotionally stuck. Another season watching other people celebrate milestones you secretly wondered if you would ever experience for yourself. But now the waiting carried a different feeling. Not easy, not painless, but purposeful in a way you had never considered before. You started recognizing how much the quieter seasons had transformed parts of you that success alone never could. The loneliness taught you how to sit honestly with yourself instead of constantly escaping through distraction. The silence forced you to confront fears you used to bury beneath busyness. The disappointments revealed how often you attached your worth to things outside your control. None of those lessons felt meaningful while you were living through them. At the time, they only felt heavy. But looking back now, you could see how every difficult season slowly reshaped your inner world in ways that made you more grounded, more aware, and strangely more compassionate toward yourself than before. One evening after work, you decided to take a drive without any destination, something you had not done in years. The city had just begun settling into dusk, and soft orange lights stretched across the horizon, while radio stations faded in and out between quiet roads. You rolled the windows down slightly and let the cool air move through the car while your thoughts drifted freely for once instead of spiraling. At a stoplight, you caught your reflection faintly in the rearview mirror and realized something that nearly brought tears to your eyes. You did not look emotionally lost anymore. Tired sometimes, yes. Still healing in many ways, but not lost. Somewhere during all the delays and confusion, you had slowly become someone stronger than the person who originally started this journey. And perhaps that was the real reason everything unfolded the way it did. Not because life was withholding goodness from you, but because the version of you from before would have mistaken temporary excitement for lasting peace. You would have chased things that looked beautiful, but quietly emptied your spirit. You would have accepted less than what truly aligned with the deeper life trying to unfold within you. That realization settled deeply into your chest as traffic lights reflected softly across the windshield around you. For the first time, you stopped viewing your story through the lens of what had not happened yet. Instead, you began seeing how much had already changed invisibly beneath the surface. Your reactions were different now. Your awareness was different. Even your relationship with silence had changed. It no longer felt like abandonment every time life became quiet. Sometimes it felt almost protective as, though the stillness itself was creating room for clarity before the next chapter arrived. And although you still did not know exactly what was ahead, the fear surrounding the unknown had started losing its power over you. Because deep down, you sensed that the repeated signs, the interruptions, the strange timing, and the quiet emotional awakenings were never about forcing you toward a specific destination. They were preparing you internally for a version of your future you could not have handled before. The waiting was never wasted time. It was transformation disguised as delay. And maybe that is why everything became quieter before things finally began changing. Because sometimes life reshapes your spirit in silence long before it changes your circumstances out loud. The strange thing about healing is that it rarely announces itself loudly. Most of the time it arrives quietly through moments that almost seem too ordinary to matter. A calmer reaction during a stressful day. A night where your thoughts finally let you rest without spiraling into fear. A memory that once caused pain suddenly losing its power over your emotions. You started noticing these small shifts more often now. Not because your life had become perfect, but because something inside you had stopped fighting reality so aggressively. You were no longer trying to force meaning out of every silence or panic every time things moved slowly. Instead, you began allowing life to unfold without immediately assuming the worst. That change alone brought a kind of peace you had not felt in years. One Sunday morning you woke up earlier than usual before the city outside had fully come alive. Pale light stretched softly across the ceiling while the apartment remained completely still except for the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Normally mornings like this used to feel painfully lonely to you. Silence often magnified every unresolved question inside your mind. But this morning felt different. You lay there staring quietly at the ceiling, realizing your chest no longer carried the same heaviness it once did. The anxiety that had followed you for so long was not completely gone, but it no longer controlled the atmosphere of your inner world. And for the first time in a very long while, you did not feel abandoned by the quiet. You felt held by it somehow. That realization stayed with you throughout the day, while making coffee, while washing dishes, while watching sunlight move slowly across the living room floor during the late afternoon hours. Everything felt softer now, not because your circumstances had radically changed overnight, but because your perspective had. You finally understood that not every season of silence is meant to punish you. Some seasons exist to clear away noise so you can finally hear yourself again beneath all the disappointment and fear. Looking back, you realized how much of your pain came from believing you were behind in life. You compared your timeline to everyone around you until your own journey started feeling like failure simply because it unfolded differently. But now you could see how dangerous it would have been for certain things to arrive before you were emotionally ready for them. The old version of you would have attached your identity to relationships that were never stable enough to carry your future. You would have accepted opportunities that looked successful externally while quietly draining your peace internally. You would have mistaken attention for connection and movement for purpose. But the delays forced you inward. They forced you to develop discernment, patience, emotional honesty, and perhaps most importantly, they taught you how to recognize peace instead of constantly chasing intensity. That understanding settled into your spirit more deeply with every passing day. Even the repeated signs that once frightened or confused you now felt less like warnings and more like reassurance that you had never truly been navigating life alone. Not in a dramatic way, not through booming answers or impossible miracles, but through quiet guidance woven carefully into timing, emotions, memories, interruptions, and moments of clarity arriving exactly when your spirit needed them most. And maybe that was the deeper meaning hidden beneath all those silent years. You were never being ignored. You were being reshaped. slowly enough that your future would no longer destroy the peace your soul had fought so hard to find. As the weeks passed, the urgency you once felt to control every outcome slowly began fading from your spirit. Not because you suddenly had all the answers, but because something deeper inside you had finally stopped demanding immediate explanations for everything. There was a quiet surrender forming within you now, and strangely enough, it did not feel like weakness. It felt like relief. For so long your mind had lived in constant tension, trying to predict disappointment before it arrived, trying to solve problems before they even fully existed, trying to protect your heart from future pain by rehearsing every possible worst-case scenario in advance. But that exhausting cycle had started losing its grip on you. You noticed it one evening, while sitting alone on your balcony wrapped in a sweatshirt, as cool air moved softly through the city streets below. Cars passed in the distance. Apartment windows flickered with warm light. Somewhere nearby a dog barked once before silence settled again. Normally moments like this would have triggered overthinking inside you. Your mind would search for what was missing, what was delayed, what still needed fixing. But that night your thoughts felt quieter. Not empty, just calmer. You realized you were no longer trying to force your future into focus before its time. And perhaps for the first time in years, that uncertainty did not terrify you completely. There was peace in simply existing without needing every answer immediately. That realization felt almost unfamiliar after spending so much of your life emotionally bracing yourself against disappointment. You remembered how desperately you used to search for signs, because you believed clarity would instantly remove fear from your life. But now you understood something different. Clarity does not always arrive as information. Sometimes it arrives as peace that slowly replaces panic even before circumstances change. And once you recognized that shift happening inside yourself, you started noticing other things too. The need to constantly revisit old wounds began fading. Certain memories no longer demanded emotional explanations from you. Some questions simply became quieter over time because your spirit no longer needed to force closure out of every painful chapter. One night, while organizing old photos on your phone, you paused on images from seasons that once carried enormous emotional weight. Places you cried in, people you thought you could not live without, moments that once felt like endings. Yet looking at them now, you did not feel bitterness anymore. You felt distance, not coldness, but completion. Almost like those chapters belonged to someone you used to be rather than someone you still needed to become. That realization brought tears to your eyes unexpectedly, because it showed you how much healing had quietly happened beneath the surface while you were busy focusing on what had not arrived yet. You had spent years believing your life was standing still, when in reality your spirit had been transforming the entire time. Slowly, patiently, invisibly. And maybe that was the reason the signs kept returning through ordinary moments instead of dramatic revelations. Because transformation deep enough to last usually happens quietly first, through softened fears, through gentler thoughts, through the gradual return of hope after long periods of emotional exhaustion. Looking back now, you could finally understand why certain seasons required silence. Noise would have distracted you from the deeper work unfolding within your soul. The waiting forced you inward until you finally discovered peace that did not depend entirely on circumstances going your way. And standing there on the balcony that night beneath the glow of distant city lights, you realized something that once would have sounded impossible to believe. The person you were becoming during the waiting may have been more important than the thing you were waiting for all along. Eventually, you stopped searching for proof that everything would work out perfectly and started appreciating the quiet evidence that you were no longer the same person who once felt completely lost. That realization came to you on another ordinary night, the kind you used to overlook without a second thought. You had fallen asleep on the couch with a lamp still glowing softly in the corner of the living room and woke sometime after midnight to the distant sound of rain tapping gently against the windows. The apartment was still, peacefully still. You sat there for a moment without moving, listening to the quiet around you, and suddenly you noticed something that would have been impossible for you months earlier. The silence no longer felt heavy. It no longer felt like punishment or abandonment or evidence that your life had somehow fallen behind everyone else's. It simply felt calm, honest, like space finally opening inside you after carrying tension for too long. You walked slowly to the kitchen and poured yourself a glass of water, while dim reflections from the city lights shimmered faintly across the countertop. Everything about the moment felt strangely sacred in its simplicity. No dramatic revelation, no sudden miracle, just a quiet awareness settling into your spirit that maybe life had been guiding you gently all along, even during the seasons you misunderstood the most. You thought back to all the nights you spent questioning your worth because certain things did not happen when you expected them to. The relationships you begged to keep, the opportunities you mourned, the silence you feared meant you were forgotten. And now, standing there in the middle of the night with rain falling softly beyond the windows, you could finally see how many of those painful moments carried hidden mercy inside them. If every door had opened exactly when you demanded it to, you might have entered chapters that slowly disconnected you from yourself completely. But somehow, through delays you hated and silences you resisted, your spirit had been protected long enough to become ready for something deeper than temporary happiness. You were becoming someone capable of recognizing peace instead of confusing chaos for love. Someone capable of waiting without collapsing emotionally. Someone capable of trusting that not every unanswered moment means rejection. And perhaps that was the true meaning behind everything that happened. Not that your life would suddenly become perfect. From this point forward, there would still be uncertain days ahead, still moments of loneliness, still questions without immediate answers. But now you carried something different into those moments. You carried awareness. You carried perspective. You carried the quiet understanding that some things unfold slowly because your spirit needs time to grow into the future meant for it. As the rain continued falling outside, you leaned against the kitchen counter and allowed yourself to breathe deeply without rushing toward the next answer for once. The future no longer felt like something you had to force into existence through fear and exhaustion. It felt like something approaching naturally in its own time. And maybe that was the final lesson hidden beneath every sign, every delay, every interruption, and every silent season that followed you here. You were never truly alone inside the waiting. Something had been walking beside you quietly the entire time, not trying to control your life through fear, but gently guiding your attention back toward hope before disappointment erased it completely. And for the first time and longer than you could remember, the silence around you no longer felt empty. It felt alive.